Elizabeth Taylor reached into Montgomery Clift's throat and pulled out his teeth with her bare hands. If she'd been 30 seconds later, he would have choked to death. But that night in 1956 was just the beginning of what Hollywood was hiding. And by the time you finish this video, you'll never watch a Golden Age film the same way again. The woman who refused to break, Katherine Hepburn, was called box office poison in 1938. 5 years later, she owned Hollywood. This is how she did it. When Katherine Hepburn arrived in Hollywood in 1932, studio executives took one look at her and saw a problem that needed fixing. She wore pants when respectable women wore skirts. She spoke her mind when starlets were supposed to be demure and grateful. She refused to give interviews, wouldn't pose for cheesecake publicity photos, and seemed utterly uninterested in playing the Hollywood game. The executives informed her that this simply wouldn't do. Female stars had a role to play: decorative, compliant, feminine in the approved way. If Hepburn wanted success, she'd need to reform herself entirely. Hepburn's response was essentially a raised eyebrow and a shrug. She kept wearing her pants. She kept refusing the publicity machine's demands. She chose roles playing strong, intelligent, complicated women, characters who talked back, thought for themselves, and refused to be diminished. For a while, her talent was so undeniable that Hollywood grudgingly accommodated her eccentricities. She won her first Oscar for Morning Glory in 1933, just a year after arriving. But then came a string of box office disappointments. In 1938, a theater owners organization published an advertisement in major trade papers declaring certain stars to be box office poison. Katherine Hepburn's name topped the list. This was Hollywood's ultimatum: conform or be exiled. Many stars in her position would have panicked, issued apologetic statements, and agreed to whatever the studios demanded. Hepburn did something that shocked everyone. She bought out her RKO contract with her own money, walked away from Hollywood entirely, and returned to Broadway to star in The Philadelphia Story, a play specifically written to showcase her talents. It was a spectacular success. Here's where Hepburn revealed her genius. When it came time to make the film version, she owned the rights. She sold them to MGM on one condition: she would star, and she would have significant control over the production. Hollywood hadn't bent her to its will. She'd bent it to hers. Over the following decades, Hepburn built the most extraordinary career in Hollywood history on her own terms. She never stopped wearing pants. She never played the publicity game. She never pretended to be anything other than exactly who she was. Her relationship with Spencer Tracy lasted 26 years, conducted with dignity despite never being publicly acknowledged while he lived. She chose roles that interested her, turned down roles that didn't, and gave performances of such intelligence and power that Hollywood had no choice but to recognize her greatness. By the time she passed away in 2003 at 96 years old, she'd won 4 Academy Awards, a record that still stands. Here's the revelation: Katherine Hepburn's 4 Oscars? She won them all playing strong, defiant women. Every single character was some version of herself. Hollywood tried to break her. Instead, she made them pay her to be exactly who she was, and called it revenge. Every actress who's come after owes her a debt for proving that women don't have to shrink themselves to succeed. Beauty destroyed, courage unbroken. While Hepburn was conquering Hollywood, another star was about to face a tragedy that would test whether courage alone could overcome impossible odds. Elizabeth Taylor reached into Montgomery Clift's throat and pulled out his teeth. If she'd arrived 30 seconds later, he would have choked on them. On the night of May 12, 1956, Montgomery Clift left a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's Beverly Hills home. He was 35 years old, widely considered the most beautiful man in Hollywood, and at the height of his career. He'd revolutionized film acting with his intense, naturalistic performances in The Search, A Place in the Sun, and From Here to Eternity. Directors fought to work with him. His future seemed limitless. He got into his car, headed down narrow, winding canyon roads, and within minutes, everything changed. Clift's car went off the road and slammed into a telephone pole with tremendous force. His face hit the steering wheel with such impact that his nose shattered, his jaw broke in multiple places, his cheekbones were crushed, and several teeth were knocked loose. He was trapped in the wreckage, bleeding profusely, beginning to choke on his own teeth. Elizabeth Taylor, realizing he hadn't made it home, drove back down the canyon to find him. She arrived at the crash scene before the ambulance, crawled into the destroyed car, and reached into his throat to remove the teeth he was choking on, quite possibly saving his life. The surgery that followed lasted hours. Doctors did their best to reconstruct Clift's face, but this was 1956. Modern reconstructive techniques didn't exist yet. When the bandages finally came off, Clift saw a face that was recognizable as his own, but fundamentally altered. The left side of his face was partially paralyzed. His jaw never quite aligned properly again. The ethereal beauty that had made him a star was gone, replaced by something harder, more damaged. Clift was in constant pain that would never fully resolve. To manage it, doctors prescribed pain medications, pills that would slowly create a pattern of dependency. The psychological trauma compounded with the physical agony, and Clift began drinking heavily to numb what the medications couldn't touch. Here's what makes Montgomery Clift's story extraordinary. He refused to quit. He'd been filming Raintree County with Elizabeth Taylor when the accident happened, and despite his injuries, despite the pain, despite the fact that his appearance had changed so dramatically that the scenes before and after don't match, Clift returned to finish the film. But here's what Elizabeth Taylor never told anyone. The night of the accident, she'd asked Clift to stay overnight. "You've had too much to drink," she said. "Sleep in the guest room." Clift insisted he was fine to drive. She let him go. For 55 years, Taylor carried a double guilt. She'd served the drinks that impaired him, then failed to stop him from getting behind the wheel. Every time she looked at him for the rest of his life, she saw the face she'd destroyed. Clift continued working for 10 more years, delivering performances in Suddenly Last Summer, Judgment at Nuremberg, earning his third Oscar nomination, and The Misfits that showcased deeper, more complex emotional layers. The pretty boy was gone, but in his place was an actor who understood suffering intimately and could channel it into art. Those who worked with Clift described a man who was simultaneously falling apart and fighting desperately to keep creating. He struggled with his lines, sometimes needing dozens of takes, and showed up on set visibly impaired. Yet, in the final product, the performances were often brilliant, raw, vulnerable, painfully honest. When he passed away in 1966 at just 45 years old, his body gave out from years of pharmaceutical and alcohol use. But he'd made 17 films after an accident that should have ended his career. Montgomery Clift spent the last decade of his life in agony, but he spent it working, creating, refusing to let tragedy have the final word. That's extraordinary courage. The rebellion that changed Hollywood, Montgomery Clift's story is about refusing to quit. But another legendary actress fought a different kind of battle, one that would liberate every performer who came after. In 1936, Bette Davis was one of Warner Brothers' most valuable stars. She'd already won her first Oscar for Dangerous, and her intense performances were making her a household name. But Davis was increasingly frustrated. Warner Brothers kept assigning her roles in mediocre films that wasted her considerable talents. She wanted to stretch herself, to take risks, to work with directors who would challenge her. The studio refused. Under her 7-year contract, she had no say in the films she made. Warner Brothers owned her services completely, and if she refused an assignment, they could simply extend her contract. It was a system designed to keep actors powerless. Davis made a decision that Hollywood insiders considered a professional ending. She accepted an offer to star in a film in England, directly violating her Warner Brothers contract. She wasn't naive. She knew the studio would sue her. She was counting on it. Davis wanted her day in court, wanted to publicly challenge the contract system that treated actors like property. Davis's lawyers warned her, if she lost, and she probably would, Warner Brothers could blacklist her industry-wide. She'd be unemployable. Her career would end at 36 years old. "Are you sure you want to do this?" they asked. Davis looked at the script Warner Brothers was forcing her to make, her 17th paint-by-numbers role in a row, and said, "I'd rather be unemployable than enslaved." Warner Brothers sued her in British courts for breach of contract. The trial became an international sensation. Here was one of Hollywood's biggest female stars, arguing in open court that her 7-year contract was essentially slavery, that the studio system was exploitative. The judge listened to her testimony, reviewed the contract, and ruled against her. Warner Brothers won. Paper, Davis had lost spectacularly. Most observers expected her career to be over. Studios would make an example of her. But something unexpected happened. The trial's publicity had embarrassed Warner Brothers badly. Quietly, behind closed doors, the studio made Davis an offer. Return to work, and we'll give you better roles and more control." Davis accepted. She returned and made some of the best films of her career: Jezebel, Dark Victory, The Letter, now Voyager, all about Eve. Here's the revelation. Bette Davis lost her lawsuit. Warner Brothers celebrated, but within 5 years, the studio system began to collapse. Davis had cracked the foundation. Davis's rebellion inspired others. Olivia de Havilland filed a similar lawsuit in 1943 that succeeded where Davis had failed, establishing legal precedent that limited studios' ability to indefinitely extend contracts. Over the following decades, the studio contract system gradually loosened, in no small part because Davis had proven that fighting back was possible. In 1993, 4 years after she passed away in 1989 at 81 years old, the Screen Actors Guild established the Bette Davis Lifetime Achievement Award. The same industry that had sued her was now using her name to represent actors' rights. She'd lost one court case and won an entire war. Every actor who's ever turned down a role, negotiated a better deal, or stood up to a studio has Bette Davis to thank. Her loss in court became one of Hollywood's most important victories for performers' freedom. Before we continue, if you're finding these revelations fascinating, please subscribe to our channel. We have many more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age to share with you. Now, you might be thinking these are all inspiring stories of triumph, but the truth is more complex and sometimes more heartbreaking. Some of these stars were fighting invisible enemies that no one understood. Some were battling their own minds. Some were drowning in guilt. Some were trapped in golden cages. Those stories show what it means to survive when survival seems impossible. The mind that betrayed a star. Vivien Lee was hiding a secret during the filming of Gone with the Wind. A secret so dangerous that if anyone discovered it, her career would end before it began. The producer suspected something was wrong. Director George Cukor was convinced she was difficult. Co-star Olivia de Havilland noticed the mood swings. They were all seeing symptoms, but no one knew what they were seeing. And Lee was desperate to keep it that way. What they didn't know was that Vivien Lee's mind was beginning to turn against her. To the world, she seemed to have everything. Breathtakingly beautiful. She'd won an Oscar for Gone with the Wind at just 26 years old. Married to Laurence Olivier, theater royalty. She was elegant, talented, seemingly untouchable. But what audiences saw on screen wasn't just acting. The intensity, the mood swings, the barely controlled chaos that made Scarlett O'Hara so electric. Those were symptoms of an illness that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Lee suffered from what we now call bipolar disorder, though in the 1940s it was called manic depression and barely understood. During manic episodes, she would disappear for days, engage in reckless behavior that horrified those around her, and become completely unrecognizable. She'd spend money frantically, make inappropriate advances, speak in rapid torrents that made no sense. During depressive episodes, she couldn't get out of bed, couldn't eat, could barely speak. The woman who commanded the screen as Scarlett would lie in darkness for weeks, unreachable. On the set of Gone with the Wind, she was already showing symptoms. The famous intensity wasn't just method acting, it was a mind beginning to fracture. Her marriage to Olivier collapsed partly because he couldn't cope with her illness. Close friends who witnessed her episodes described them as terrifying. Lee herself, during lucid periods, lived in constant fear of the next breakdown. She never knew when her mind would betray her again. Studios and co-stars worked desperately to cover for her. When she couldn't function, they'd shut down production and claim illness or exhaustion. Hollywood protected her secret because mental illness carried such stigma. Admission would have ended her career instantly. The treatments available were primitive and brutal. Lee underwent electroshock therapy multiple times, a procedure where electrical currents were sent through her brain to induce seizures, supposedly to reset her mental state. The treatment was agonizing and only partially effective. It helped stabilize her temporarily, but left her confused, her memories damaged, her personality altered. Each time she emerged, she had to rebuild herself, never quite sure if the illness would return tomorrow or next week. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. Hollywood knew. Studio executives, directors, her co-stars, they all knew Vivien Lee was mentally ill, and they actively hid it, not to protect her, but to protect their investment. When she had breakdowns on set, they'd lock her in her dressing room until she stabilized. When she couldn't remember lines due to electroshock damage, they'd feed them to her off-camera. When journalists asked questions, the studio publicity machine threatened them into silence. Vivien Lee wasn't just battling her own mind. She was battling an entire industry determined to extract every ounce of profit from her suffering. What makes Lee's story remarkable is that she kept working. She won a second Oscar for A Streetcar Named Desire in 1951, playing Blanche Dubois, a woman descending into madness. The role wasn't a stretch. It was terrifyingly close to what Lee experienced during her worst episodes. The fragility, the disconnection from reality, the desperate clinging to beauty and fantasy. Lee didn't have to imagine those feelings. She lived with them. Her performance remains one of cinema's most devastating portrayals of mental breakdown. She was acting, yes, but she was also channeling her own terror of losing her mind. By 1965, Lee could no longer hide it. Her final film, Ship of Fools, required 23 takes of a single scene because she couldn't remember her lines. The director gave up trying to get it in one take and pieced it together from fragments. It was the last role she'd ever play. 2 years later, tuberculosis and the accumulated damage from years of electroshock therapy and mental anguish finally took what was left. When she passed away in 1967, at just 53 years old. Those who knew her best said it wasn't tuberculosis that ended her life. It was exhausting. 53 years of fighting your own mind is a war no one can win forever. The woman who played the indomitable Scarlett O'Hara spent her life proving that survival isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, even when your own brain is telling you to stay down. The war hero who came home, broken. While Vivien Lee was fighting her invisible war, another star returned from a very real one. Forever changed. America's cheerful everyman came home from World War II weighing 130 pounds. He'd left at 170. What happened to Jimmy Stewart in those 4 years? Something so terrible he never spoke about it publicly for the rest of his life. Stewart hadn't taken some cushy celebrity assignment. He'd flown 20 combat missions over Nazi Germany as a bomber pilot, commanding crews through hell. He'd watched planes explode midair, friends disappearing in balls of flame. He'd dropped bombs on cities below, knowing civilians were being obliterated. He'd made decisions that sent men to their end and lived with the faces of those who didn't make. At home, Jimmy Stewart, who returned to Hollywood in September 1945, was unrecognizable. His hands trembled constantly. He couldn't sleep without nightmares. Loud noises sent him into visible panic. He'd lost 40 pounds and couldn't gain them back. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder had no name in 1945, no treatment, no understanding. Veterans were simply expected to come home and resume their previous lives as if nothing had happened. But Stewart couldn't do that. The cheerful everyman who charmed audiences in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington no longer existed. In his place was a haunted stranger who flinched at unexpected sounds and woke up screaming. Hollywood executives worried he'd never work again. Then director Frank Capra, who'd served in the military himself, offered him a role that would save his life. It's a Wonderful Life was about a man at the end of his rope, contemplating ending his own existence, who's shown by an angel. How many lives he's touched. For Stewart, the role wasn't acting, it was therapy. Here's what most people don't know. During filming in 1946, Stewart had a complete breakdown on set. Capra shut down production for 3 days. No one knew if America's favorite star would ever work again. But Stewart came back. And when he filmed George Bailey's breakdown scene, the desperation in his voice when he begs to live again, that wasn't a performance. That was a combat veteran with PTSD genuinely asking the universe if his life had meaning. Capra kept the take because it was the most honest moment ever filmed. Stewart never discussed his war experiences publicly. Even decades later, when historians tried to document his service, he deflected questions. It was only after his passing in 1997 that his family revealed the full extent of his military decorations: the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, and the Croix de Guerre. America's cheerful everyman had been a decorated war hero who'd seen things that would have destroyed most people. Yet he'd found a way to channel that trauma into performances of extraordinary emotional depth. The hesitant speaking style, the vulnerability that made him so relatable. These weren't just quirks. They were the visible traces of a man who'd looked into the abyss and barely climbed back out. The King's Guilt. Jimmy Stewart survived war and found redemption, but another king of Hollywood faced a different kind of war, one fought entirely within himself. Clark Gable did something 7 months after his wife's passing that shocked Hollywood. Something so extreme his friends were convinced he'd lost his mind. What he did next would take him to Nazi-occupied Europe and nearly cost him his life. To understand why, we need to go back to January 16th, 1942. Clark Gable spent 20 years trying to get back to his wife. The problem? She'd been gone the entire time. On that January morning, the undisputed king of Hollywood sat in his Encino ranch, waiting for Carole Lombard to come home. She was flying back from a war bond tour where she'd raised over $2 million in a single day. The night before, they'd talked about whether she should take the train or fly. Carol chose the plane. She wanted to be back in his arms faster. What Gable didn't know was that TWA Flight 3 had already slammed into Mount Potosi, Nevada. All 22 people aboard lost their lives instantly, including the woman he loved more than fame itself. When word reached him, Gable refused to believe it. He chartered a plane immediately, convinced there'd been a mistake. He arrived to find wreckage scattered across the mountainside. Witnesses recalled seeing the King of Hollywood stumble through debris, calling Carol's name, his face drained of color. He insisted on joining the search and recovery team, hiking up treacherous terrain in his street clothes. When they finally recovered her body, identifiable only by strands of blonde hair caught in a tree branch, something inside Clark Gable shattered beyond repair. The guilt hit immediately and never loosened its grip. Here's what broke him. Gable had been scheduled to go on that tour. Studio obligations kept him in Los Angeles. If he'd been on the plane, would the extra weight have forced them to take the train instead? If he'd insisted she take the safer route, would she still be alive? Friends watched the confident movie star transform into a hollow shell. He drank heavily, showed up to sets looking decades older, gave performances stripped of the spark that made him a legend. That's when he made his shocking decision. At 41 years old, well beyond combat age, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces. He didn't request a safe publicity role. He volunteered for combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe as a tail specialist on B-17 bombers. Friends understood what Gable never admitted aloud. He was trying to join Carol. But here's what even his closest friends didn't know. He'd written a letter before his first combat mission. Instructions to be opened if he didn't return. The letter has one line: "I'll be with Carol now. I'm sorry it took so long." He wanted to perish in that war. Every mission was a second chance. At the ending, fate had denied him. But fate refused him that escape. Gable survived, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, and returned to Hollywood in 1945. He resumed his career, married twice more, and kept making films. But those closest to him knew the truth. The man who returned wasn't really Clark Gable anymore. He was a ghost playing the role of the king, going through the motions while carrying grief no amount of fame could touch. When he finally passed in 1960, his final words to the doctor were about Carol. 20 years later, he was still trying to apologize for surviving. The princess in a gilded cage. Clark Gable couldn't escape his guilt, but another star was about to discover that you can also be imprisoned by a dream come true. Jimmy Stewart fought Nazis. Grace Kelly fought something worse, the slow erasure of her own identity. On April 19, 1956, Grace Kelly stood in the Philadelphia Museum of Art wearing an ivory silk taffeta gown, preparing to marry Prince Rainier III of Monaco. At 26 years old, she was at the absolute pinnacle of her career. An Oscar winner, Alfred Hitchcock's favorite leading lady, with offers pouring in. The wedding was broadcast to 30 million television viewers. America's golden girl was becoming an actual princess. How could anyone ask for more? But what the cameras didn't capture was the look in Grace's eyes. A flash of something that might have been panic or grief or both. Because Grace Kelly understood, even as she said those vows, that she was trading her identity for a crown. Monaco's constitution was clear. The Princess of Monaco was not an actress. She was a symbol, a figurehead, a mother of heirs. The creative fire that had driven Grace to leave Philadelphia's high society, that had to be extinguished now. The palace required it. The people of Monaco expected it. And Rainier would enforce it. For the first 6 years, Grace tried to convince herself it was enough. She threw herself into royal duties, learned French, studied Monaco's history and customs. But by 1960, she'd started having panic attacks before public appearances. Palace staff would find her hyperventilating in bathroom stalls, mascara running, unable to breathe. Her personal diaries, revealed decades later, showed entries like, "I don't know who I am anymore. The woman in the mirror isn't me." That was Grace's first attempt to escape. There would be 2 more, each more desperate than the last. In 1962, Alfred wanted her for Marnie. It wasn't just any role, it was the role that could mark her triumphant return. Grace approached Rainier, her excitement barely contained. For 3 days, she waited for his answer. 3 days where she allowed herself to imagine. The set, the cameras, Hitchcock's direction, becoming Grace Kelly, the actress again. She'd already started preparing in secret, reading the script late at night, practicing scenes in empty palace rooms. Then the answer came. No. Not just no. Absolutely not. When word leaked to the press, Monaco erupted. "Our princess wants to play a thief and a liar," the headline screamed. Under pressure from all sides, Grace withdrew. She called Hitchcock personally. Friends who heard the call said her voice was flat, empty, as if something inside her had finally given up. Tippi Hedren got the role. That door closed forever. In 1976, attempt number 2, she secretly met with a Hollywood producer about returning to film. The meeting was discovered. Monaco blocked it immediately. In 1980, the final attempt, her daughter asked why she'd given up acting. Grace broke down crying, unable to explain how a cage can be beautiful and still be a cage. 3 times Grace Kelly tried to reclaim her identity. 3 times Monaco pulled her back. On September 14th, 1982, Grace was driving with her daughter Stephanie on the winding roads above Monaco when she suffered a stroke. The car went off the cliff. Grace was rushed to the hospital. Doctors said she might survive. For 24 hours, the world waited, but the injuries were too severe. Grace passed away the next day at 52 years old. Those close to her couldn't help but wonder, had the stress of playing that role for 26 years contributed to the stroke? Had the sacrificed dreams, the years of slowly perishing inside, somehow manifested physically? Could you quite literally perish from a broken creative spirit? Grace Kelly had lived the fairy tale the world envied. But fairy tales don't mention the cost of the crown. If you're moved by these stories, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which revelation surprised you most? And what other aspects of Hollywood's golden age would you like us to explore? From glamour to warrior grace, Kelly's story ended in tragedy. But the woman who saved Montgomery Clift's life? Her story is about becoming a warrior. Elizabeth Taylor had been famous since childhood, a stunning beauty defined by her violet eyes and tumultuous love life. By 1985, at 53 years old, she'd been married 8 times, twice to the same man, won 2 Oscars, and was known primarily for her glamour and jewelry collection. She seemed to be living proof that beauty and fame could insulate you from the world's problems. And then Rock Hudson got sick. Hudson and Taylor had been close friends for decades, co-stars in Giant back in 1956, confidants who understood each other's secrets. When Hudson began showing symptoms of what would eventually be diagnosed as AIDS in 1984, Taylor watched helplessly as her friend deteriorated. This was the height of the AIDS crisis, when patients were treated as pariahs, when President Reagan refused to even speak the word AIDS publicly, and when funding for research was virtually non-existent. Most celebrities stayed far away, terrified that any association would taint their reputations. Elizabeth Taylor did the opposite. When Hudson passed away on October 2nd, 1985, Taylor didn't retreat into private grief. She got angry, furiously, righteously angry at the injustice of a condition destroying an entire community, while the government and most of America looked away. Within weeks, she co-founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR. She testified before Congress, scolding politicians for their cowardice. She organized the first major AIDS benefit in Hollywood, using her legendary status to convince other reluctant celebrities to participate. She wasn't gentle or diplomatic. She wielded that defiance like a weapon against bigotry and neglect. What made Taylor's AIDS activism so powerful was that she didn't just lend her name. She became the face of it. She was photographed hugging AIDS patients when many believed the condition could be transmitted by touch. She spoke publicly about Rock Hudson's final months, humanizing a condition society had been treating as an abstract punishment. She raised over $270 million for AIDS research over the course of her life. She used her fame, her beauty, her legendary status, all the things Hollywood had valued, to force America to confront a crisis it desperately wanted to ignore. When Elizabeth Taylor passed away in 2011 at 79 years old, many concluded that her AIDS work was as important as any film she'd ever made, perhaps more so. The movie star, who'd been dismissed as beautiful but lightweight, had proven that glamour, properly wielded, could be an instrument of tremendous social change. She'd transformed from Hollywood royalty to an actual warrior for those society had abandoned. Rock Hudson's courage in revealing his diagnosis sparked a national conversation. Elizabeth Taylor's courage turned that conversation into action that saved countless lives. The love that couldn't be named. Elizabeth Taylor's activism was public and celebrated. But sometimes the most profound devotion happened entirely in private, like the impossible love that defined 2 of Hollywood's greatest stars for over 2 decades. For 26 years, Katherine Hepburn loved a man she could never fully have. But in 1967, she would face an impossible choice. What she chose would define both their legacies. But there's a mystery at the center of this story, a secret that wouldn't be revealed until decades after both were gone. Spencer Tracy was 50 years old when he met Katherine Hepburn on the set of Woman of the Year in 1941. He was already a legend, a two-time Oscar winner known for playing moral authorities, priests and fathers, men of unshakable integrity. But Tracy's personal life was far more complicated. He'd been married to Louise Treadwell since 1923, and their son John had been born deaf. Tracy, a devout Catholic, believed his son's condition was divine punishment for his own sins, a guilt that fueled severe depression and alcoholism. By the time Tracy met Hepburn, his marriage to Louise existed in name only. They lived separately, rarely spoke, but Tracy's Catholic faith absolutely forbade divorce. He would never leave Louise officially. When he and Hepburn fell in love during the filming of Woman of the Year, both understood immediately that their relationship could never be publicly acknowledged. Hepburn would never be his wife. She would never walk a red carpet on his arm. For 26 years, she accepted this impossible situation with remarkable grace. The arrangement required extraordinary emotional discipline. Tracy and Hepburn maintained separate residences, but Hepburn kept a cottage specifically for him. Here's how it worked. When Tracy's alcoholism spiraled, he'd disappear to that cottage for days. Hepburn would cancel everything, nurse him through the darkest episodes, hide his bottles, hold him while he shook with withdrawal. Then, when he stabilized, she'd watch him dress, fix his tie, and walk the door, back to Louise. Back to his official life, where Hepburn didn't exist. Imagine loving someone so completely that you become their sanctuary, and then watching them leave you, over and over, to fulfill obligations to someone else. They made 9 films together, professional collaborations that allowed them time together without raising suspicions. The press politely looked the other way. In the early years, the secret worked. Middle years brought close calls with exposure that terrified them both. Late years, as Tracy's health declined, forced increasingly difficult choices. Meanwhile, Tracy continued to visit Louise regularly, supporting her work founding and running the John Tracy Clinic for Deaf Children, a remarkable institution that pioneered teaching deaf children to speak. He never cut ties with Louise, never stopped being legally her husband, even as his emotional life centered entirely on Hepburn. Yet she stayed. She loved him completely, accepted the terms he could offer, and never pushed for more. But Louise Tracy wasn't a fool. She knew something was happening. The question wasn't whether she knew. It was what she chose to do about it. When Tracy passed away in 1967 at 67 years old from cardiac arrest, he was in the cottage Hepburn maintained for him. She stepped aside for the official rituals, allowing Louise and the Tracy family to handle funeral arrangements. At his funeral, she sat in the back while his wife played the grieving widow. Here's what no one knew at the time, what Hepburn herself only learned years later. Louise knew about Katherine. She'd known for decades, and she'd made a conscious choice not to stop it. She understood what Hepburn couldn't admit. Spencer needed someone to hold him together, and Louise had given up trying years ago. Only after a respectful period did Hepburn begin speaking publicly about their relationship, and even then, with enormous respect for Louise's dignity. What emerged was not a tawdry affair, but a relationship of genuine depth between two people navigating impossible circumstances. Tracy had loved 2 women. Louise from duty, guilt, and shared history. Hepburn from emotional and intellectual connection. Both women handled the situation with remarkable grace, neither making demands that would have forced impossible choices. This triangle wasn't a scandal. It was a testament to human complexity. 3 people handled an impossible situation with as much grace as anyone could, and all 3 deserved respect for that. The final act of courage, which brings us to one final story, a man whose grace under impossible pressure would ultimately help change the world. Rock Hudson stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, devastatingly handsome, with a smile that made millions dream of romance. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, he'd been Hollywood's ultimate leading man, the star of glossy romantic comedies with Doris Day, epic dramas like Giant, adventure films that showcased his physical presence. To audiences, Rock Hudson was the epitome of masculine romantic perfection. What the public didn't know was that every moment of Hudson's public life was a carefully constructed performance designed to hide his authentic self. Hudson had signed with agent Henry Wilson in the late 1940s, when he was still Roy Scherer, an awkward truck driver from Illinois with movie star looks but no acting experience. Wilson specialized in creating stars, giving them new names, new backgrounds, and strict instructions about how to present themselves publicly. For Hudson, this meant living in constant fear that anyone might discover he was attracted to men. In 1950s America, this truth would have ended his career instantly and possibly resulted in criminal charges. So Hudson played the role of eligible bachelor, dated women publicly, smiled through questions about settling down. When Confidential magazine threatened to expose him in 1955, Wilson arranged a marriage to his secretary, Phyllis Gates. The union lasted 3 years, long enough to quiet the rumors. Then they divorced, and Hudson returned to his carefully closeted life. For 30 years, Hudson lived this double existence. Publicly, he was the romantic ideal. Privately, he had relationships with men, always in secret, always with the terror that one photograph could destroy everything. The strain took an enormous psychological toll. But Hudson had no choice. Coming out would have meant the end of his career, social exile, and potential legal consequences. So he kept the secret. Kept Rock Hudson the romantic hero, while Roy Scherer remained locked away. In 1984, Hudson began feeling ill. He attributed it to age and exhaustion. He was 58 years old and had been working steadily for over 3 decades. But the symptoms worsened. He was eventually diagnosed with acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. This was the height of the AIDS crisis, when the condition was ending thousands of lives, primarily in the male-attracted-to-males community, and when societal reaction ranged from fear to outright hatred. AIDS patients were treated as pariahs. President Reagan had refused to even acknowledge the epidemic. Research funding was minimal. Hudson faced a choice: maintain his secret as his health deteriorated, or reveal the truth and potentially humanize a condition that desperately needed a face America would care about. For months, Hudson tried to keep working while hiding his illness. By July 1985, he'd become so visibly ill that he collapsed in Paris. On July 25, 1985, his publicist issued a statement: Rock Hudson had AIDS. The announcement shocked the world. Suddenly, AIDS wasn't just affecting anonymous communities that mainstream America could ignore. It was afflicting Rock Hudson, the romantic ideal, someone millions of Americans had welcomed into their homes. The revelation forced people to confront their prejudices about who could contract the condition. The impact was immediate and profound. Donations to AIDS research organizations doubled overnight. Public discourse shifted from blame and fear toward compassion and concern. Hudson's courage in acknowledging his condition, effectively coming out as attracted to men in the process, put a human face on suffering that society had been trying hard to ignore. His friend Elizabeth Taylor immediately mobilized, co-founding AMFOR and making AIDS activism her primary focus. The announcement Hudson made accomplished more for AIDS awareness and research than years of advocacy by others had managed. Rock Hudson passed away on October 2, 1985, at 59 years old. In his will, he left $250,000 to help establish AMFAR, ensuring that his final act would continue helping others. But here's the revelation that changes everything. Rock Hudson's AIDS announcement changed medical history, but he'd wanted to come out for years. The condition that ended his life also freed him. In his final months, Roy Scherer, the truck driver from Illinois, finally got to exist publicly for the first time in 30 years. The man who'd played romantic heroes for 3 decades proved that true heroism had nothing to do with movie roles and everything to do with choosing truth and service over self-protection. He'd lived most of his life unable to be fully himself, but he used his ending to free others from similar prisons of fear and silence. That's the story of someone who transformed personal tragedy into public service, who chose courage when it would have been easier to go quietly, and who helped change the course of medical history by simply telling the truth. These 10 stories of triumph and rebellion, courage and resilience, mental illness and survival, trauma and determination, sacrifice and defiance, love and activism, reveal that the stars we thought we knew were far more complex, far braver, and far more human than their carefully constructed images ever suggested. Katherine Hepburn refused to bend and made Hollywood pay her to be herself. Montgomery Clift kept working despite devastating injuries. Betty Davis fought the system and helped free an entire generation of performers. Vivien Lee fought her own mind every single day. Jimmy Stewart came home from war fundamentally broken and somehow kept performing. Clark Gable carried guilt that would have destroyed most people. Grace Kelly sacrificed her creative soul for duty. Elizabeth Taylor transformed from glamorous star to AIDS warrior. Spencer Tracy and Katherine Hepburn navigated impossible love with remarkable dignity. And Rock Hudson used his final months to help save countless lives. These weren't just actors playing parts. They were warriors fighting battles most of us will never face, carrying burdens that would have crushed ordinary people, yet continuing to give us performances of extraordinary depth and beauty. The next time you watch Gone with the Wind or or It's a Wonderful Life, or Rear Window, remember what you now know about the people on that screen. They weren't living charmed lives. They were surviving impossible circumstances while still managing to create art that has endured for generations. Understanding the complete truth about these legendary performers doesn't diminish them. It makes their achievements even more remarkable. They gave us beauty and joy and unforgettable cinema despite carrying pain most of us can barely imagine. That's not just talent. That's courage. That's resilience. That's the human spirit refusing to be defeated. And that's why their stories, the complete stories including the parts we never knew, deserve to be told and remembered. If these revelations have given you a deeper appreciation for Hollywood's golden age stars, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who love classic cinema. These stories matter, and these remarkable people deserve to be honored for their complete humanity, not just the images they presented to the world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue exploring the untold stories of Hollywood's golden era.